Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, Cost Analysis, Are You Making Money? This webinar was organized by the Niche Meat Processor Assistance Network, and my name is Lauren Gwynn. I'm the co-coordinator of MPAN. I'm based at Oregon State University and glad to be your host today. MPAN does webinars on topics related to small-scale meat processing and farmers and ranchers who raise meat for local and other niche markets. If you'd like to be on our email list to learn about webinars like this and other resources on our website and participate in the great information sharing on our listserv, please sign up at our website, which is www.nichemeatprocessing.org, and we'll type that into the chat box. And if you have webinar topic suggestions, please feel free to email us that too, and we'll type our addresses also into the chat box. So just a quick moment about MPAN to let you know, for those of you who don't know, MPAN is a network of people from University Extension, from state departments of agriculture and other agencies, from nonprofit groups, from other regulators from federal and local, and others who are supporting small and very small meat processors and the producers who work with them. We've got lots of processors and producers in our network. And we are part of E-Extension, a national initiative of the land-grant university system that brings the best university extension information to the web. So 3 things before we start. There are going to be plenty of time for questions, and Arian says that he can take some questions as we go through it. If you want to ask a question, please type it into the chat box, which is on the left-hand side of the screen. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on the MPAN website for later viewing with the presentation slides. And if your question doesn't get answered, you can email us after the webinar, and we'll try to get it answered. So our agenda today, many meat processors watch their checkbook balances and hope for the best. Some wade through profit and loss statements looking for answers and often come up short. Most small processors don't fully understand why they are or aren't making money and what they can do about it. So today we hope that you'll learn how to develop systems that will give you the financial information you need to make decisions that improve your business's performance. So our speaker today for this webinar is my MPAN co-founder and co-coordinator, Arian Tubumari of Lawrence Meats and the Vermont Packing House. Arian is currently the managing partner of Vermont Packing House, which is a new small meat processor in Vermont. He received his doctorate from Iowa State University in sustainable agriculture and meat science. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Lauren. Welcome, everybody. Glad that folks can make it today. As Lauren said, I will be taking questions throughout the discussion here. Some of the small questions I'll get to right away, and if they're a larger question, I might just sort of punt them till the end. So moving on in the slides here. So particularly like Lauren said, it's not just are you making money, but also knowing why and why you are or why you aren't, and so that you can do stuff about it, because the point is to have control over your business. That's what we sort of all aspire for, even though it's not always possible all the time. So a little outline here, just to give a little bit more background about me, and why I have anything to say on this. Then talk about making money in terms of measurement and goals, and then get into products and pricing. And then I'm going to go into some examples at the end where you have sort of investment decisions based on whether it's an equipment purchase or a hiring decision, and how you can evaluate whether that's a good decision within the framework of your business. How much more money does that decision have to make you to pay for itself in a reasonable time frame? So just to kick things off, so I am Vice President at Lawrence Meats in Cannon Falls, Minnesota. We are starting a new processing plant in southern Vermont in North Springfield, so hoping to have that up and running by June. And this is Lawrence Meats back in cold and snowy Minnesota. It's a facility where it processes about 40 head of beef a day or bison, and we process that all the way from slaughter through cutting and grinding into RTE, our fully cooked products. So, our facility now is coming up to just under 100 employees we've got out there right now. So we've been doing this for a little while, and that's sort of where this comes from, the presentation today, but also from working with small plants through MPAN. So everything at Lawrence Meats goes out the door on pallets, pretty much. You can tell it's quite busy in there based on this slide, our sausage making area. everything goes out. A lot of retail products go out in roll stock packaging. It's an emphasis that we work on to try and have a little bit more sophisticated operation. These are some of the customers that we serve, from Organic Prairie, Thousand Hills Cattle Company, High Plains Bison. Those are some of our bigger customers. Work with local grocery stores. So, to the gist of it, so you want your processing business to make money. I'm gonna assume that that's true for everybody. I'm gonna assume that there are no hobbyists on this call. So how do you know that how you're doing? And these are some answers that I get from folks. Pretty standard answers. I check my bank account balance every week, and you know, is it going up or is it going down? If the trend is an upward trend, I must be doing okay, and that is true. There's definitely some truth to that. But is it as accurate as you'd want to be? I asked my accountant. You know, that's also a pretty standard answer, and you know, I'm for a pretty small business, it's a reasonable answer. But we're going to get to is even more actionable than just asking somebody how's it doing, because you want to know why, because the why is really important, because that lets you do things. So these are other answers. We're in the black at the end of the year, and this last one, my personal favorite: work like hell to get as much done as possible, and just hope for the best. You know, just let your day fill with optimism, and you're probably doing fine. But again, the why is so important, and you know, so you want to know what makes you money and what doesn't. So there are two things. There's two ways to make money. The first one is to do things that are profitable. This is sort of a duh answer. But the second thing is oftentimes it's the second part of this is also very, very important, and it also seems kind of duh. But I think a lot of people don't often think about it as well. That the second point is stop doing things that are not profitable. We all have this. I have this. Everybody I know has this. They have their pet projects that they really like, and they just hope that it works out. And it's hard, but oftentimes those things, they're either not charging enough for them, or they're just not a good product for you, but you really like making them. So it's important to understand that. You may also make certain products that are loss leaders, that you're making this product for somebody, and in order to get another business or some other work that is much more profitable. We have some products where we make a chicken sausage that is not very profitable, but we also make these pork sausages, and they're sold to the same customer, and they need both of them. But we make much better margin on the pork sausage, so that balances out the chicken sausage. It comes out as a reasonable deal. So the real question is, if you're doing things, you want to do things that are profitable, you want to stop doing things that are not profitable, which is which? So again, coming back to what is making you money and why. So to get information on specific types of work, we have to find organized ways to collect information about profitability, about what's happening in your plant. So I'm now going to talk in sort of from the 30,000-foot view, sort of the larger Gaap accounting level, narrowing down to like daily in-plant measurements about profitability and meeting production goals. So starting off with sort of at the accounting level, this big picture is creating departments in Gaap Accounting. So Gaap Accounting is the regular accounting that your accountant does. Everybody's got their books, their profit and loss, their balance sheet. Gaap stands for Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. It's standard accounting. So the way we're going to operate at Vermont Packing House, we're going to have three different departments. My example here is processing, which I would count as, you know, slaughter and fabrication. Further processing, which would be like grinding or maybe some sausage making. In a small meat processor, you might have three different departments, which would be processing, further processing, and retail. So, sorry, this is foreshadowing sort of what's going to come after that. I'm going to talk about daily production goals and daily monitoring, and then pricing on individual products. Those are the sort of the three layers. So to talk about Gaap accounting for a second, the example that I like to use if I'm in a room of people speaking with them is that let's imagine that you have, your bank account essentially is a cup. It's just like a teacup or a mug, and all your money comes into it, all your revenue comes into it, and all your expenses come out of it. So somebody, Farmer Sally drops off a beef, and she has it cut up, and she's got some grinding done, and she also has some sausage making done, and all the revenue from all those different, let's imagine that those are different line items. There's a line item for slaughter, there's a line item for fabrication, there's a line item for sausage making. All those different items, they just go into that one cup. And then you pay different people out of that cup. You pay the guy who works on your kill floor. You pay the guys who work in your cutting room, guys and gals. You pay the guys and gals that work in your sausage department, and all the revenue comes out of that cup. And that makes it very challenging to know, if Bob on the kill floor is taking twice as long as he should be, and he's costing you a bunch of money. It's hard to know whether you're losing money in that area because it's all your revenue and all your costs are going in and out of that one cup. On the flip side, if you use departmental accounting, this is breaking down your business, your organization, into multiple cups. Let's say 3 different cups. So now you've got revenue that's associated with slaughter and fabrication, and those go into one cup. And maybe the people who work in slaughter and fabrication, they are in the same area. Some days they work on the slaughter, some days they work in cutting. So you want to put them together. So you receive all your revenue into that one cup, and you pay all your expenses. You pay your labor, you pay your supplies. Maybe you take a certain amount of your overhead or a certain amount of equipment payments that you also put in that area, and you make that area almost like it's its little standalone business unit within your larger business. We can talk about how to allocate overhead in a little bit. And then you take your further processing, which is maybe, let's say your sausage making, and those are separate line items, and you take that revenue and you put it into its own cup, and you take all the expenses out of there, which would be your labor, let's say it's your seasoning, your casings, your non-meat ingredients like your cheeses and in Minnesota, wild rice and cranberries or whatever it is in your area. And then you take all those costs out of there. So you can see at the end of the month, you can say, oh gosh, if you break this apart, let's say, oh gosh, I'm not charging enough. I can't be charging enough for sausages because that department is losing money. And the whole this is just hypothetical, obviously. The whole time, the basic processing has been carrying the heavy weight. It's been lifting up the further processing, that sausage making, and I just didn't see it. So you can start to see some of these things on a sort of a grander scale. And then you can have your own retail area separately where you can basically have an internal transaction where you sell your retail area some processed product, and then your retail area has to pay for itself. It needs to pay for its square footage. It needs to pay for all the retail help. And so you can really start to see, where is my money coming from? Again, it's sort of, this is still a 30,000-foot view, but you need this view along with other views. Where is my money coming from? So does that, any questions? I know this is sort of cumbersome with the chat box here, but any questions on that sort of that 3-cup system versus the 1-cup system? And I hope that analogy makes sense. Again, it's going to be a little cumbersome in the webinar format.
If you don't have the question right now, you can go ahead and post it, while you're thinking about it, as area in charge.
We can come back to it.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So the next thing that you want to do in terms of setting production goals and daily monitoring is, let's say that you figure out if you take all of your, gosh, I thought there was a slide between there. Okay, this is a. I'm going to go to this slide and then come back. So if we take all the expenses, this is data that was from a report that Lauren and I put together. That is basically these are average costs based on a handful, more than a handful of businesses that we looked through, have been through their finances. The average cost that it takes to run a small processing plant. You know, very small, small, so, you know, very small, less than 10 employees. Small is, you know, that's probably less than like 20 in this circumstance. And so, you know, if we add up all these costs, the raw materials, the labor, the office, the overhead, all these other things, and then we divide by 254, which is the standard number of work days in a calendar year, we get an overhead number. And what we need to do when you add up all your costs based on your historical records, you divide it by 254, that's the amount of money that you need to make every single day. So what that does is it starts to tell you when you're looking at your processing areas, how am I going to make, you know, in this circumstance with a very small plant, how am I going to make $910 today? Or with a small plant, how am I going to make $2,225? So you take your own. So in this particular circumstance, we go back, and so to set a production goal, what you would do is you would take all your costs, and if you, again, we're using that three cup accounting system. So you take all your costs and you take your specific labor and cost by a specific department, and then you allocate your overhead, which would be your other things on this page, which would be office-related overhead. You know, for example, if you have some clerical help, somebody comes in part-time or whole-time. Processing-related overhead, which would be like your building, your electricity. Other overhead might be your salary, loan interest and depreciation. That would also be associated with your building, associated with equipment. So you take all those things and you allocate them to a specific area, and we can talk about allocation basis in a second. And then you know your price of your product that you charge. So in this example, let's just say that you need to make $1,000 in the cutting room every single day. Let's just say that that is the math that you've determined. So you take your, and let's say you charge, just for the sake of this discussion, you charge 50 cents a pound on the hanging weight. So your cost of goods plus overhead is $1,000, and you want your weight times price to be greater than $1,000. So this is how you're translating your daily goal into an operational activity. So from, gosh, I need to make this much money, to how much product does that translate to that I need to cut in order to meet that goal. So in our equation here, we take weight times price greater than cost of goods and overhead. Cost of goods and overhead, again, are $1,000. Our price is 50 cents. The weight that we have to solve for means I have to cut this many carcass pounds to make this equation balance in my favor, is 2,000 pounds, right? Of course, I'd ask one of you guys in the audience, but it's too cumbersome with the typing. So in that circumstance, you know, if you have to get 2,000 pounds, that is, you know, probably on the rail, that's going to be like 3 beef, you know, approximately. That depending on the size of your beef, maybe it's 4, maybe it's 3.5, you know, whatever the weights are that you're doing. You know, if they're all 600 pounders, it's 3, and it's basically 3.5. If they're 700 pounders, you got it at 3. So the question at the end of the day, did you make it? You know, you tell the guys in the cutting room, we got to cut this much weight. You got to get this much weight cut today. How are we going to do that? And then you know at the end of the day whether you did it. So that was an operational decision. That was immediately. You don't need to look at your P&L. You don't need to check with your accountant. You know, did I cut enough pounds today? So common questions associated with this is, I don't know my overhead. So ask your accountant to allocate work area based on labor hours, square footage, or cost of property and equipment. So what labor hours are is that you have, let's say you've got 5 people, and each of them works 40 hours. But 4 of them work in the cutting room, and 1 of them makes sausage. So what that means is that every week, 4/5 of your labor hours are happening in the cutting room, and 1/5 is happening sausage making. So I think labor hours are a reasonable way of allocating expenses, or your overhead expense, because it tells you where activity is occurring. You know, where's stuff happening? Obviously where there's lots of people working. You know, it's not happening in the back storage room where nobody goes, so, you know, allocating that square foot cost is a tricky thing to allocate. Labor hours is a little bit of a better sense of here's where things are happening that make you money, so let's allocate cost to those. But square footage and the cost of specific property and equipment is, you know, can work in certain circumstances. So another common problem in small plants is my employees work all over the place. How do I allocate their costs to these departments associated with forming this daily goal? Or even also associated with doing my departmental accounting, like I said, in Gaap Accounting at that 30,000-foot view. So my answer to that is to allocate wages to the work area on a % basis. So if Fred works 50% of his time in the cutting room and 50% of the time in the kill floor, on average, we don't need, you know, it's important to be accurate generally. Don't waste a lot of time being super precise. So accuracy over precision. You know, go with what you think is a reasonable % allocation on a yearly basis, not on like a weekly basis, because that's too much of a pain. And then let's say we did that math, and you know, the math which was on the previous page where it said we had to cut 2,000 pounds in a day. Let's just say, you know, you're 2 people, and you're just like, oh, we can't cut 2,000 pounds in a day. That's just not possible. Well, so here are your options: raise prices, add more people. Because if you can't, you know, if you are not making those daily goals, if you know that here's the overhead number you have to make, and you're not making it, you got to do something. If you're like, well, I can't raise prices, well, can you add more people and get more done? Is that an option? Oh, you can't do that either? Well, then you're looking at your last option that you possibly can offer is get people to try and get the work done faster. And that's where production incentives come in. Maybe that's where you say, okay, every day that we meet this goal, everybody gets their hourly wage and they get an extra $10. You know, or every week when we hit these goals 5 days in a row, everybody gets $50 extra. You know, these are numbers that I'm just making up, but providing the incentive out there to clearly articulate the goal with your employees so that you're all on the same page and you know what it's a good job. Because I fundamentally believe that everybody wants to do a good job at work. And if you can clearly define it and articulate what you want them to do and show them how it's going to be measured, your employees will deliver for you. And you know, particularly if you can offer them some incentives. But I think even just articulating the goal of saying we got to cut 2,000 pounds today in this time frame is going to be tremendous. So on that last note, there's maybe a conflict of interest for people to cut faster because they work by the hour. So if it takes them 2 hours to get the job done instead of 1, they made twice as much money. So how can you share that? So yes, there's production incentives to help them work faster. Another thing that you might do is offer them a minimum hour guarantee by saying, look, you know, if everybody gets this done at 3 o'clock today, even though it would be otherwise a full day's work, I'll pay you the full day till 4 or 5 or whatever your work day is. You know, that you guarantee them, we might get done early. If everybody gets done early, you still get your 8-hour day, or you still get at least 7 hours, even if you only work 6 because we were so fast. Because at the end of the day, here's my logic for this. At the end of the day, you bill based on the amount of work done, even though you pay your employees on an hourly basis. So if you got all the work done, why not pay them what you would promise to pay them anyway? Because it's better, just, you know, it's less of your time tied up managing them, looking what's going on in the plant. Maybe you can go home early, too. Wouldn't that be nice? So here's an example of a production goal. This is a larger cutting. I'm going to show the next page one that's just a little bit smaller. But this is, you know, I would put the production goals out there at sort of break time, so it's, you know, that okay, first break. I'll show you a smaller plant version. It's just simpler. First break, you know, let's say starting at 7. Let's say your first break is at 9. You've got 4 beef that you're going to get done, and you got 5 people. So by the first break, 1 beef is going to be done. But when you break for lunch at 11, the second one is going to be done. And by the time you take the afternoon break, the third one's going to be done, and you're going to be done at 4 p.m. So this is just putting it out there, and it's also saying it's breaking it down for your employees and for yourself of here are the expectations, but in even more bite-sized pieces. So, hey guys, 9 o'clock is coming. The break is coming. The break's coming, and this beef isn't fully packaged and done. We need to be picking up the pace here a little bit. Let's keep going. You know, just so that there are these markers along the way. You know, it's kind of like would it be really hard to know how fast you were driving with no speedometer? So this is like giving people the speedometer. So again, coming back to setting production goals, what you need to know, your cost of goods, which is labor plus packaging. I would argue that labor is always a cost of goods. You know, spices, etc. The amount of overhead to allocate to an area, and the price of your product. And you need to solve for this equation. Weight times price is actually, that should be greater than or equal to cost of goods or overhead. And you solve for the weight. So similarly, what about sausages? You know, people, it's the same information, it's from a different angle. So in this sense, this has to do with, now we're going to solve for price at the end. So what we need to know is the cost of goods also, so the labor and the packaging, the seasoning, the spices, etc. The amount of overhead allocated to the area, which would be the sausage production area. And now we need to know the batch weight and the time to get it done. So in this circumstance, it's going to be how much sausage can I get done? How much expense do I have? That tells me what price I need to charge to make my daily goal. Because you know, your hanging weight price is not going to change every day. But if you make different kinds of sausages, you can charge different prices. And how do you know how much to charge? You want to price things based on what prevailing market is, because that is always helpful. But you need to know what your costs are, and you need to know that that prevailing price is higher than what your costs are. And you may be able also to charge a little bit above market if you have a premium product. And sometimes these products are so specialized that there is no clear market. You know, whether you charge $1.50 or $2 a pound, there may be no cost basis with another competitive processor, so you really have that much flexibility. But you don't want to gouge your customer also. So you want to figure out what it really costs you and what's a reasonable margin. So here's an example. Pork trim, rapidly escalating in price these days, but this is a little bit, I put this together a little bit ago. So here's a spreadsheet, exactly how I would sort of build it on developing costs for a product. And so you have your pork trim times the amount used. There's your cost of the batch, your seasoning mix, your cheese, your casings. You know, here's your labor, and that's important that that is a encumbered wage. So you pay somebody $10 an hour, it really costs you probably something like 12 or more, 12 to 13, because by the time you pay their workers' compensation, your share of FICA taxes, other benefits that you may offer, including, you know, health insurance. You know, Lawrence Meats is big enough now that we're required to offer health insurance. Vermont Pack House will offer health insurance. And so you need to know what that real number is. And then your cost of packaging, and then your supplies, which would be, I just use a department average across the year, which, you know, again, supplies would be, you know, gowns, gloves, that sort of thing. And then an overhead that you give to that particular department for this amount of time. So we add up all those costs, and then we take the yield, because we never get 100% yield unless we add a lot of water to a cooked product. And then we get a cost per pound, and then I also backed off the no meat costs. So let me go back to this what about sausage. So let's say, so we know again, per the discussion that I was just talking about on this page, we know that that sausage basically costs us $1.30 per pound to make, all encumbered. And that was based on the fact that we could make 102.6 pounds in an amount of time that I don't have worked out here, but in an amount of time that was basically $30 worth of labor and $30 worth of overhead. So it is true that I don't exactly pencil this out how you would figure out that amount of time. But the point is what you would do in real life is you would have your crew note on a production log sheet. Here's when they started the project. Here's when they ended the project. And so you take that many people that are actually working in that department, you take their hourly wage plus that wage multiple, and then you develop a cost to produce that project. And that's where that would be that. That's how you would get that $30, which is just right in the labor row of that example. Hope that makes sense. So please type your questions in if you do have a question associated with that. That didn't show. Gosh, okay. So the last thing that I was hoping to talk about is how you would evaluate a decision to purchase a new piece of equipment. And I thought I had the math in here, but I guess I flipped through the slides too quickly and deleted that one out. So I apologize about that. But I'll explain the gist of it is if you add an expense, how you need to evaluate the payback for the increased value of that expense is what does it add to your daily production goal? So, for example, if you add an expense that costs you, let's say it costs you, for the sake of this discussion, let's say it costs you $254 over the course of a year. It's a minor expense. You know, it's something like it's a small piece of equipment, and that is the payment that you have to make every year. So you divide that by your number of work days in the year, so 254. So it costs you $1 a day to have that piece of equipment in the room. And the question is can you make $1 more of a sale in order to justify having that piece of equipment because you bought the piece of equipment? So if you look at something much bigger, let's say it's a $50,000 stuffer, and you need to divide, you need to say, let's say that you're going to pay for that stuff for over 10 years. That means $5,000 a year, plus there's interest on top of that. Let's say the interest is, another $1,000 a year on average. So $6,000 a year. And you divide that by 254 working days. That is going to make about about $25 a day. That's my back of the envelope math. That was in the spreadsheet, the slide that I deleted. So it's going to make about $25 a day. $50,000 sounds like a lot of money, but over 10 years, only selling $25 more a product a day, and it's also important to emphasize that is $25 a day more profit. So you have to make margin. So you have to take cost of goods out of that, which would be your casings and your labor and that sort of thing for that new sausage stuffer. But if it just gives you $25 more a day in overhead, so you have to have 20. So you may be, depending on, let's say, half of the money you make goes to cost of goods. So maybe it's $50 more a day on sales. The question is, can you do that? So again, how you would evaluate the decision is $50,000 stuffer, $25 more of margin a day. That equals $50 more of sales. Can you sell that much more sausage, or can you make that much more sausage to sell in one day, every single day, 254 work days a year? And if the answer is yes, because you have that much more capacity, you can put that much more out the door, and you know that it will sell because sales are strong, then that $50,000 decision is an easy decision to make.
So, Arian, that's the end of your slide specifically. I want to encourage people to, he just went over a lot of material, and we have time now. We have at least 20 minutes to go back and have him go through specific examples again, to ask some more specific questions about the analysis he's suggesting. There's a question from Ryan. Many of the slides rely on effective cost accounting. So what kind of accounting or business systems?
What kind of accounting or businesses work well in this industry? That's a great question. You know, I do think I am increasingly a fan of QuickBooks. And I'm not, you know, I'm not paid to say that. That's not an official promotion, but I think that it's relatively easy to use. But it you know, it just is. You got to do it. That's the hardest thing. Is just the daily entry. You know, it doesn't really matter what accounting system you use. You just got to do it every day, and you got to actively, you know, you got to keep track. You got to make sure that you're billing for everything properly, of course, but you also got to make sure that you're posting everything to specific accounts. And like I said, that departmental accounting using Gaap, you know, the 3 cups instead of the 1 cup, I think that's a good way to go, and that has to do with how the accounts are set up. So you know, I think I would advocate that most, and many people do this already, that, you know, all the stuff that you don't like doing, and mostly, you know, I didn't get into the meat business because I love accounting. You know, I mean, I don't mind it, but it's not my favorite. And I'm pretty sure that most people out there in the meat business or any small business didn't get into it because they love accounting. Hire someone. You know, hire somebody to do it. Pay them. You know, you can find somebody to keep track of your books probably just about anywhere in the country for somewhere between $12 and $15 an hour. You can find a fairly competent person to do all of your bookkeeping and entry. And just think about that's, you know, the stuff that you hate, in my opinion, counts double because of the mental duress. So it's very much worth it.
Carrie wants to go back and look at the slide on the small production schedule.
Sure. Oops. So again, this is just, you know, my back of the envelope math typically, just as a reference number, is that from a half a carcass, or from sides of beef, and this is, I just use beef in this example, to packaged retail cuts. And this is not with fancy portion cutting where everyone's the same. This is like you're breaking it down at a small locker plant. It takes about 8 man-hours per beef. Obviously, there's some variability associated with that, the size of the beef.
Okay. Let's look at the small one, the slightly larger example.
A slightly larger example. So this is, yeah, this is based on, this was one from a long time ago, actually, that we used at Lawrence Meats that I put into a slide. And when you're just fabbing to subprimals, it obviously goes a fair bit faster. So that's what this math is based on. You know, you're going to want to. I think that 8-hour number is a pretty good number to use in a facility, especially a lot of smaller facilities. 8 man-hours, and again, that's from the beef hanging to packaged, ready to put in the freezer or the cooler, whatever you're working on. In this circumstance where you're fabbing to subprimals, it's going to be very different. It's going to be customer specific. So we have numbers based on specific customers that we're like, fabbing their beef on average takes this many man-hours. That's what we can plan on. That's what we can schedule. And we continue to actually beat it. You know, once you put that, you know, it's kind of like Olympic records. You know, once you put the record out there, somebody's always beating it. It's not like people are running the 100-yard dash slower than they were 50 years ago. No, they just seem to keep doing it faster.
Can you talk a little bit more about, I mean, I think that what a lot of very small plants run into is back to that question of, my people are all over the place, how do I allocate my overhead? And one of the things you've said is, don't try to get into, it's 8% here and 16% here. It's, if you think about just some big buckets, maybe it's 50% here and 25% here, and you still have to think of your plant in terms of departments, even if there's only a few of you there.
And I think that that's true. And I think, you know, you got the, let's say the one person, you know, like I said, slaughters a couple days a week, works on the cutting floor a couple days a week, makes sausage 1 day a week. I think it's good to think about it in sort of like those kind of 20% increments, you know. How many days of the week are they actually in this area versus this area? And that puts it into these sort of round like, oh, they're 40% here, 40% there, and 20% here. To finesse much more than that probably isn't helpful. You know, because again, we're not trying to get the 100% true scientific answer. You know, we're not NASA. We're not trying to measure in, you know, thousandths of an inch. We're trying to see, gosh, where is my plant? You know, what departments are losing money and what departments are making money on like a big picture level, so that you can then go in there and start to drill down a little bit more about, well, why is that happening here and why is it happening there? And the answer is never going to be, oh, it's because I misallocated 5% of Fred's time here. That's not going to be the answer. It's going to be much more obvious than that.
One question that came up, which was slightly off topic for this, but when you make your estimates about how you're going through, I mean, you're basically assuming that there's a consistent cutting speed, that the size or quality or that specific animal factors that might vary, that doesn't really factor into your calculation.
No, I mean, it would in the sense that, per the example in terms of the cutting floor, where I said, you know, figure out how many pounds you need to cut in a day to make your margin goal. So if you've got, you know, a bunch of lightweight, you know, cull cows or something like that, and they're coming in at 400 pounds on the rail, like, you're going to need to cut more of those than you are going to need to cut like big, you know, big fleshy beef. So it's important to know, but then when I put the production goals out there, I translated it into head. And that's because that's just that much more obvious to folks that are actually in production. Like I'm talking about, like when I show this small plant slide, this very small plant slide, I should say, you know, this is like, I'm trying to, I put this on the wall. Everybody in the cutting floor knows this, you know. That today at 9 o'clock we're going to have one of these beef done, because let's say on average they come through at about this weight. But if you really have a lot of variability, you might need to finesse this a little bit more and say, we're going to have these two specific beef done at 9, and these, you know, because they're small, and then the next hour, you know, the next 2 hours we'll work on 1.5 of these other beef. And so you penciled that out ahead of time. You saw that here's the beef you have hanging in the cooler. Here are all their weights. Here's how many pounds I have to cut. I'm going to break that down across the day.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question about, for allocating labor costs into overhead, do you do each person's yearly wage divided by a percentage?
When I do, you know, what I would do is, you know, if they're a salaried individual, yeah, because they're salaries and so they're paid the same all year round. What I would do is actually, and you know, a lot of accounting, you know, some payroll systems are very good about this, some are better than others, that on, let's say you do biweekly payroll and you've got hourly employees, so you want to post on average 40% of Joe's time to this department and 60% of his time to this other department. And that is, you can set that up usually in your accounting system, or you might need to run it through a spreadsheet. It sounds a little bit cumbersome, but it's really not that bad once you get into the swing of it. And remember, you know, you're paying somebody else to do this, so you don't have to do it. But it is helpful. I'm talking about on again, salary, I do it yearly, but on a biweekly basis, let's say if you have biweekly payroll, I would actually allocate I would do the allocation every time I do the split.
And there's a couple questions coming in, but I'm wondering if other people on this call, other processors who are here, use production goals that they've calculated based on a daily goal they have to meet. One of the things we found several years ago, Arian and I were involved with trying to do some financial benchmarking, trying to come up with some benchmarks for small and very small plants to use to know how they were doing and potentially to compare with other plants. There's a similar system used by cooperative grocery stores, and But what we found is that there needed to be a big shift in the cost accounting system so that people were actually able to allocate their costs instead of money in, money out, that they had a better sense of what in their plant was making money and if they had those production goals. So I'm very interested to hear what other folks are doing.
One thing I would also say in regards to that is that, you know, I've come across a fair number of small processors located in different parts of the country, and you know they run a lot of expenses through their business that are not really business expense. You know, the business buys their car, and the business, you know, and they take cash. They receive some things in cash that they don't put on the books. And, you know, it may be great in the sense that they don't pay that much in taxes, and they've got a safe filled with, you know, $20,000 in the back. I mean, this is a real example. That may seem personally great for them, but I feel like it is shooting yourself in the foot in the long run, because if you ever go to get bank, you know, if you want to go to get bank financing to make a real investment, you need to show that your business, you need to show your true business cash flows, and you need to show that your business is profitable. The second thing also is I feel like this is shot, you know, that sort of style of accounting has shot a lot of small processors in the foot in terms of being able to sell their business. Not only because they can demonstrate profitability to a potential buyer, but that potential buyer is going to need to get financing from a bank, probably, almost overwhelmingly likely. And if they can't demonstrate that your business is profitable with real financial statements, they're not going to be able to do that, and that means they can't buy your business. And so I think that, you know, doing honest accounting to show what's really going on, if your business is really making money, is a better long-term strategy, even if you end up paying a little bit more in taxes. You know, heaven forbid.
There's a couple questions coming in, slightly off topic, but as far as doing on-farm processing for a couple months out of the year, if you can do it profitably, I think there would be a lot of factors that would have to go into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is that you have a space that you have to make that you're probably borrowing money on. At the very least, you're depreciating the asset, and that happens every single month of the year. So when you take that, all those overhead costs that I showed, but let's say you only operated 3 months out of the year, so instead of 254 days, you're going to have to divide all those costs. You're going to have to divide all those costs. Let's say you do it 4 months out of the year. You're going to have to divide all those costs by 85 days. So that's a lot. You know, like, oh, you got a lot of overhead. You really got to make a lot of margin during those few days if you're going to make that thing pencil out. So I caution against that. And also, you know, go support your local processor, you know, so they can have more services for you.
I was glad to see Darren writes in that this is almost identical to the accounting process that he's using. So that's great.
Yeah, I see this next question coming in. Simple tools you use to estimate the benefits of hiring a new employee. That's going to be, you know, I would say work with your accountant to come up with a number, and it's going to be a wage multiple, and it's going to be between 1.2 and 1.3. So 20 to 30% of your hourly wage cost is you're going to have on top of the hourly wage you're already paying them. And so that, you know, you can use whatever number. Those are the numbers that I would use, but what you're going to need to add up is, like I said, your taxes, because you have to pay, as an employer, you have to pay your share of taxes on the W-2, so that includes wages, Social Security, Medicare. So you have a share that you have to pay on that. You have workers' compensation. That's going to be based on a rate that will vary from state to state and based on your particular classification code. So you could see a significant swing in that depending on where you're located. And then you're going to have other things. You know, do you offer short-term disability, long-term disability, those kinds of things that would also factor in. And then health insurance, also a huge variable that varies widely from state to state. So you really do need to put some numbers together, but those are sort of the big categories. There may be a couple other things. You know, do you have some sort of local taxes or something that's a factor associated with wages or employment that you also contribute to as an employer? You're going to need to look into that.
And couldn't you also, Arian, in the same way that that's a decision you can evaluate. You can say, here's the cost of hiring someone. Now, to cover that cost, we're going to need to move we're going to need to sell, have this much more money in profit, right? In the same way that you said, how do I evaluate whether I buy a stuffer?
Yep, that's exactly the same. That is exactly the same. You know, the thing is actually people cost a lot of money. You know, people are sort of like always typically your largest expense, and for a good reason. And good people are worth good money, and that's who does things. You know, machines sit there, people do stuff. So, you know, if you're thinking about hiring indirect labor is one of the most difficult decisions facing a lot of small plants. So let's say you're going to hire a QA manager because you are just have had it up to here with your HACCP plan and you just don't want to be the lead point of contact anymore because you've got so many other things going on. And so if you're going to hire somebody to come in, you know, you're going to need to pay somebody who's reasonably competent. So let's say you're going to pay them, you know, $35,000, $40,000 a year. So you take that cost, let's say it's 40, you have a wage, let's say it's 40 fully encumbered, just for the sake of discussion. You take that $40,000 a year and you divide it by 254, and you get that's $157.50 every day that you need to figure out how to come up with. And that's more margin. Again, that's not sales, that's margin. So you need to have that much more cash. So you're probably looking at something like $325 more every single day more of sales that you have to have associated with hiring that full-time QA person. So how are you going to do that? What's your game plan? It's much more expensive than a piece of equipment, but you can also generate certain things from QA, the biggest one being less mental duress for you as the owner-operator. The other ones would be, are you able now to qualify for a certain third-party audit that you really didn't have the time before? And now because of that third-party audit, you can now sell to this retailer or this wholesaler. And because of those sales, because of that, you can actually sell, you can way exceed the sales goals that you need to sell and the margin goal to pay for that QA person. You know, that's one of those ways that can you make that indirect labor provide more market access that will get you more sales. That's how we look at it.
Great. There was a question earlier about how does input from farmers affect your planning and your bottom line. Wouldn't you say that the main input you need from farmers is the agreement that they're bringing you a certain amount of animals on certain dates and that they're partnering with you to keep the business going?
I absolutely agree with that in terms of, you know, just the do what you say and say what you do. You know, you will arrive at this day, at this time, with this many animals.
Are there other slides that folks want to see here in the presentation? We will be posting them on our website, but other calculations that people would like to see. We also we did a webinar several years back on product costing, and there are some similar analysis helping people think through sausage and how to measure their costs. I see another question coming in.
Yeah, well, I would also just put out there, if you have a question that comes up after this, I'm going to put my email address on there. You know, feel free to shoot me an email. I do my best to get back to you. If it's a really long question, it might take me a little while.
Arian, there's as these questions come in, you know, we had a discussion the last couple of weeks about busyness, keeping people busy, and one of the things came up is that when you identify places in your plant, not everybody has to be working insanely all the time. You know, there are particular places in the plant that are kind of the constraint, the place where that always needs to be busy. But, you know, to say, well, we're going to be more productive, so everyone has to be moving at light speed at every moment.
Yeah, working like heck to get as much done as possible. Yeah, I think that's a good that's such a big topic.
It's a big topic, but
great for another webinar. But I think it is something that's good to consider that, you know, if you got one guy who's grinding meat all day for sausage production and he's grinding it faster than anybody else can mix it or stuff it, is his product valuable? And the answer is no, because the car only drives down the street as fast as the slowest wheel turns, because it's all got to get there at once. And so if one person is just, you know, breaking their neck to get everything done so fast, but it's dependent upon what the other people are doing, you know, because it's a series of dependent events, then that really doesn't help.
Right. And we will address this in a future webinar, thinking about how that works. There's a question here, any simple tools to figure out tipping points for whether adding deliveries would be cost effective or not?
You know, I mean, I would say the same thing. You know, what's your overhead on the van or the truck or whatever it is to drive deliveries? How much does the driver cost? Can you either charge enough specifically for the delivery, or could you increase existing sales enough to pay for that overhead? You know, is there enough margin? I mean, that's how I would approach that.
Here's a question about an example of batch weight and time for one ready-to-eat product. Maybe we need to go back through your previous example.
Oops, this is the wrong direction. So the wait time to produce solving for price needed to meet my daily goal. So that's kind of this one. So what you need to do is figure out, you know, do a batch of the product and figure out how long it takes you to do that batch. So if a batch is 100 pounds, you know, this is also one of those things that if somebody comes to you with a new sausage and says, hey, I want you to make the sausage like this, and it's different from anything you've ever made before, or even if it's pretty darn close, if it's not exactly the same, do a test batch and make sure that it really costs you what it really costs with real ingredients and how long it really takes you to make it. You know, acknowledging that the first time you do everything, it always takes a little bit longer. But the problem that you can run into if you don't do that and you just guess, unless you're pretty darn sure or you've been doing this for a while and you really have a good feel for it, if you just guess, what if you're wrong and you committed a price to them? So don't commit the price until you've run a test batch. Give them a ballpark figure. Say it'll be in this range, but you've got to actually do a batch. And that way it gives you, you know, without destroying your credibility, it gives you, and it also gives you an opportunity to increase your credibility that says, we want to price this right just for you. You know, that it's your special sausage and we're going to give you a special price. But we got to show, we got to see how long it really takes us to make it. Because we also ran into a situation where we priced a product based on the price of another product, and, oh, it was supposed to be just like that other product except for these 3 little things. Well, it turns out those 3 little things took a lot of time. And that product, it took us months to recover from that. That product lost margin. We had negative margin on that product. And so it was very challenging to dig out of that and then go back to the customer and slowly escalate the pricing because they'd already committed to their customers, and it was a big deal. So really good to do some tests before you commit firmly on a price. Great.
Well, thanks, Arian. I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. We appreciate everyone joining us today. We really appreciate Arian's time trying to explain, you know, a complicated system like that. And if you have other questions or would like to go through the slides again, or think that you'd like to go through this in a smaller group discussion at some point, let us know. We're open to ideas. Just a reminder, the webinar has been recorded. It will be posted to our website. We will send info out to the list. Here is our homepage to join our listserv so you'll be notified, and also to let us know other topics you'd like to see us address. So thank you very much, Arian, and thank you all for being here today.
Yep. Thanks, folks. Okay. Bye now.